Hi, I'm Janet Davis. I am a board member at the Rye Historical Society, and each Sunday evening we are hosting a happy hour, and we will be reading from Parsons' History of Rye. This week I'll read Chapter 5, Some Old Residents and Where They Lived. Richard Goss was probably one of the first settlers at the center of town. As 20 acres of common land were laid out to him, at or near, quote, Breakback Hill by the road between Sandy Beach and Greenland in the year 1701. It was owned afterward by his son Thomas and his daughter Elizabeth, and her son Michael D. Goss, and the latter's son James Madison Goss and his heirs. Thomas J. Parsons bought the farm, and at present it is owned by Daniel J. Parsons. The one-story house, which stood where Andrew G. Locke erected his new dwelling house, was formerly occupied by Reuel Garland, Oliver Genis, Albert M. Walker, and others who worked at their trade in the blacksmith shop nearby. It was moved there from near where Elvin Locke built his house. It was built by Merrifield Berry for his son Ebenezer, who married Polly, daughter of Colonel Benjamin Garland. She, being a very proud and high-spirited woman, refused to live in such a small house and returned home. She was an invalid for more than 40 years and was known as Aunt Polly. Her son, Thomas Garland Berry, a merchant in Portsmouth, subsequently came into possession of Colonel Benjamin Garland's farm. Noah Dow, in 1760, lived above Andrew Locke's on the opposite side of the highway on the quarter-acre lot adjoining the road and now owned by Daniel J. Parsons. The old well is still to be seen under the hill. Dow was a very little man and had a son Nathan who removed into the country. Christopher Amazine of Newcastle conveyed to Jonathan Locke of Portsmouth a tract of land in Newcastle, Rye, 31.5 acres laid out to me March 26, 1722, by the Committee for Dividing the Common Lands of Newcastle. The property has been retained in the Locke family up to the present time and is now owned by Deacon Jonathan Locke, who is living, 1903, at the writing of this novel, at the age of 90 years. Old Dr. Mack, so-called, and Samuel Wallace lived opposite Joseph Locke's home, which is now owned by Freeman J. Locke. Samuel, the father of Samuel and Ebenezer Wallace, fell from a load of hay in front of Freeman's Locke's and broke his neck. He made a will after the accident, giving all his property to Samuel. He owned a part of the Locke farm up to the Berry land in front of A. H. Drake's. Before the road was straightened, there was quite a sharp corner in front of the Freeman Locke house, and it was known for many years as the Wallace's Corner. John Locke formerly occupied the next house, then his son, Captain Samuel J. Locke, and the latter's son-in-law, Nathaniel Marden, and his sons, Irving and Samuel A. In 1723-24, Samson Sheaf Jr. of Newcastle conveyed land to William Locke, carpenter, of Hampton, and Ebenezer Berry of Rye. On November 28, 1748, Thomas Goss gave a bond to build a house for Ebenezer Berry. The old Berry house was taken down, and the present one erected by Joseph William Garland. Ebenezer Berry was succeeded by his son, Merrifield, then General Ira Brown, Reuel Garland, and his son, Joseph William, and at present, the farm is owned and occupied by Albert H. Drake. Charles Green built the house now occupied by his son, Orrin S. Green. Jonathan and son Joseph Goss, prior to 1800, lived in from the road. Then Samuel P. Garland, and at present Clarence Goss. Samuel Wells resided near George Lang's house. Ozam Darst lived where the walnut tree grows in the pasture of Charles D. Garland. The cellar is still to be seen beyond the residence of Mrs. Albion D. Parsons. At the foot of the hill on the north side of the highway lived Moses Seavey, Joseph Philbrick Jr., and his son, John Philbrick, and at present, Walter Peake. Jonathan Dolbear lived on Philbrick's Hill in John Garland's pasture. Nicholas Dolbear resided in the house where Lieutenant Simon Brown and his sons, Langdon and John Henry, lived, which is now occupied by the latter's son, Howard Brown. Abraham Libby resided opposite William J. Rand's in the field of the late William C. Garland. Bickford and John Lang lived where Darst Rand and son William afterward lived, then William J. Rand and his son Joseph William. There was a Joseph Rand called Burnt Ear who lived near the residence of William Cutter Garland and his brother Samuel near Levi Garland's. Tradition says there was a schoolhouse located in the corner of Charles D. Garland's field near the Shapley Field. If so, it was at a very early date. Probably the first schoolhouse in that part of the town was situated east of Langdon and John H. Brown's. There was a Hutchings who lived near the location of the present wooden schoolhouse. Stephen Marden resided near the Hutchings on the same side of the way. Ephraim Rand lived beyond Garland's Corner and died in the Revolutionary Army. Redmond lived opposite the house erected by Josiah Genis and where Genis resided previous to his going to the beach. The house is now occupied by Mr. Goodwin. Jonathan Toll lived at the Bunkers and Nathan Toll on the Samuel Genis farm. It is said William Randall lived on this farm and died or perished on Woodbird's Hill coming from Portsmouth. His widow sold out and went up country. Samuel Wallace Genis was succeeded by his son, Samuel W., and the latter's son-in-law, Charles S. Whidden. Amos Rand, cordwainer, lived on the corner where William Cutter Garland resided and opposite the store on the latter's son, Charles D. Garland. It is said that Francis and Ephraim Locke, who were grandsons of the Locke of Locke's Neck, having sold their farm to the Garlands, moved to Epsom. John Garland resided on the premises for many years. Deacon Reuben Shapley came into possession of the property, and it is still occupied by his son, Rule. The Browns lived in the Levi Garland house, now the residence of Samuel Smart. When Garland bought it, the Browns kept their pigs in one part and lived in the other part. The Dows occupied the farm on the opposite side of the highway for many generations. Richard Janis, Esquire, lived upon his farm at the Breakfast Hill probably prior to 1750. His dwelling house, long since torn down, stood in a field on the southeast corner of Lafayette and Breakfast Hill Road, nearly opposite the residence of his grandson, Amos S. Genis, which is now, in 1903, occupied by the latter's son, Joseph G. Genis. Samuel Seavey lived near here. He was the brother of Joseph at the Four Corners. Jonathan Drake lived on the west side of the Lafayette Road, then his son, Cotton Ward Drake, and at present his son, Charles A. On the opposite side of the road lived John Drake, and his son-in-law, Jacob Marston, and the latter's son, John D. Marston. From Garland's store to Chelsea's Four Corners lived Stephen Marden. Then, in the old Moses Dalton house, which has since been torn down, lived his father, Ben Dalton, Tristan Sleeper, and a Mr. Libby. David Smith and Ephraim Gould lived near Calvin Garland's farm. Further south lived Richard Janis Sleeper, the farm now being occupied by his son, Martin V. Sleeper. There was a house located in the lane near the residence of Alfred Seavey. It was occupied by Samuel Knowles, Thomas Sleeper, and Henry Genis, and then taken down. Joseph Seavey lived at the Four Corners, where the buildings of the late William S. Garland now stand. John Godfrey married Seavey's daughter and lived there. On the north corner, William Sleeper began a tavern for a number of years. His son, Charles B., afterwards lived there, and at present, his grandson, Charles E., occupies the old mansion. William E. and Simon L. Chelsea lived on the west corner and kept store there for a number of years. Edmund Johnson and the Elkins family lived near the Four Corners. Robert Moulton lived on Little Boar's Head and sold it to J. Brown and moved up to Gilmanton. His brother lived where Cyrus Jones resides. Richard Genis, called, quote, Lawyer Dick, lived on the corner near Charles W. Spears and owned the land where Albion Philbrick resided. It is said his house was hauled down on the mill road for old Mr. Simon Locke and is occupied at present by Augustus Caswell. Thomas Genis lived where Lieutenant James Perkins lived and exchanged farms with James Perkins of Hampton about 1730. The first Philbrick, who settled within the present limits of Rye, sowed a piece of grain in the field now occupied and on which is erected one or more buildings of the Farragut House. And a party came up from Hampton and burned the grain, calling Philbrick a squatter. He was finally allowed to remain. A writ, or summons, issued 1702, directed to the Constable of Hampton to bring the body of Joseph Philbrick of Hampton to the Court of Sessions to be held in Portsmouth. A presentment was made by the grand jury against him for having built a house upon the town's land in Hampton, near the house of Francis Janis. Francis Jennings, or Genis, emigrated to this country from England in 1665 and took up his residence at Great Island, now Newcastle, pursuing the avocation of mariner and fisherman. In 1671, he moved to Rye, then a part of Hampton, and married Hannah Swain. He established an extensive bakery on his land. The territory which he took up, and most of which was laid out to him by the town of Hampton in 1675, extended in a strip along the seacoast from Jocelyn's Neck, or Locke's Neck, in a southerly direction for 3/4 of a mile, including good mill privileges. He erected his dwelling house close by this mill stream, some 40 rods to the eastward of the present bridge across it, and on the easterly side of the dwelling house now occupied by one of his descendants, Mr. J. Disco Genis. Francis also erected a sawmill and a grist mill, and put up buildings for a bakery. The nearness of the latter to the sea was a great convenience in the carrying on of his business. By means of ketches and small pinnaces, he distributed his bread and sea biscuits all along the coast, from Saco to Boston. He is said to have been a very large and strong man. Upon one occasion, when he had visited Boston with a cargo of his ship biscuits to sell, he was stopped in the street by a renowned bully from an English man of war, lying in the harbor and bantered to a fight. Francis, in vain, sought to pacify the man. Neither argument nor persuasion would avail. At last, his patience gave out, and seizing the astonished gladiator by the collar of his jacket, he tossed him with ease over the top of a 6-foot fence onto an adjoining lot, and then resumed his course, unruffled and unimpeded. The youngest child of Francis Jennings, named Richard, married Mary Dow, and settled down near the old homestead. Upon the decease of his father, Richard succeeded to the ownership of the home farm. Captain Richard Genis, for so he usually wrote his name, was a public-spirited and influential citizen. In 1726, the territory north of Jocelyn's or Locke's Neck, formerly known as Sandy Beach, which had hitherto been a part of Newcastle, was formatted into a distinct town by the name of the, quote, parish of Rye. This new parish being declared entitled to representation in the Provincial Assembly, the first member returned by it to the House of Representatives was Captain Richard Genis. The legality of his election was contested, but after argument, he was declared duly chosen and took his seat in the House, which at that time consisted of but 16 members. He continued to represent the town for nearly 40 years. One of his first acts upon entering the legislature was to procure the passage of a bill for which he had previously petitioned in 1721, setting off to the new parish of Rye a large tract of land, embracing his own and Mr. Philbrook's farms, which lay south of Locke's Neck, all of which had long been in dispute between Hampton and Portsmouth. The bounds of Rye thus formed, together with an addition made in 1791 on the extreme north, correspond with the present limits of the town. Captain Richard bought large tracts of land at Breakfast Hill, Portsmouth, Little River, and back in the country. His fifth child, Richard, resided at Breakfast Hill. Jonathan Brown, commonly known in his day as White House Jonathan, from the fact that his house was the first house in town to be painted white, was succeeded on the farm by his son Joseph Ward, and then by his son Charles J. Brown. On the corner where Howard Rand resides lives a Mr. Moulton, then Cornet Jonathan Brown Jr., Daniel Marden, and his son Otis D. Marden. James Locke lived near Colonel Simon Genis. The Colonel's house is now occupied as a store by his grandson, Emery C. Genis. Locke moved to Portsmouth or Deerfield. I'm reading to you today from the house which was then occupied as a store by his grandson, located at 420 Central Road in Rye. Elijah Locke lived on the corner near the house occupied by Nathan, and at present by his son, Charles N. Knowles. William Locke lived near the residence of Gilman Garland. Jonathan Philbrook, Esquire, then his son Daniel, occupied this farm, which at present Daniel Webster Philbrook lives on with his two sons, Alfred and Irving. David Locke, who married Hannah Lovering, lived on Fern Avenue. Then Joseph Drake and his son, John Orrin Drake. Jeremiah Locke lived down near Rye Harbor. Then General Thomas Goss, his son, John Sheridan, and at present, Wallace S. Goss. Joseph Locke, who married Hannah Janis, lived where John Oliver Locke built his house and lived. In 1756, Robinson Trefferin, mariner, sold to Benjamin Garland et al. At Rye Center 17 acres of land with house, barn, etc. Benjamin's daughter Sarah lived there until her death. Also, his daughter Polly, who married Ebenezer Berry, and their son, Thomas Garland Berry. The heirs of the latter sold to Leonard Cotton of Portsmouth. Mr. Haskell bought the property, and recently the old inn has been purchased by R. Higgins of Boston for a summer residence. The space in the highway in front of the house was formerly known as Garland's Common. Reverend Huntington Porter lived in the house now owned and occupied by Albert M. Walker and made extensive additions to it. Jethro Locke, Major Joseph Locke, Albion D. Parsons, and James W. Marden also resided there. Benjamin Marden and his wife Hannah Rand lived down in the pasture by Gammon's Brook, so called, and moved his house up on the parsonage land by consent of the town near the present Christian church, where his son-in-law Samuel Marden, then his son Lowell S. Marden, lived. William J. Walker tore down the old house and rebuilt. Olive Libby, a daughter of Reuben Libby, who married J. Harris, lived in the Libby pasture near Gammon's Brook, and used to say that she could go any day to the fall of the year over to Locke's Neck and gather a bushel of walnuts, the neck at that time being covered with walnut and oak trees. The residents at Locke's Neck during severe droughts would drive their cattle up to Gammon's Brook for water. The parsonage house, built by the town in 1810, was sold at auction to John Tuck Rand, and is at present occupied by his son, Isaac D. Rand. William Berry, who was living in 1786, gave his farm to his son, Jeremiah Berry. Afterward, his son, Levi Berry, occupied the premises, then Joseph L. Locke and Samuel Walker, and his son, Levi T., and daughter Eliza Ann Walker. It is at present occupied by Herbert Perkins. The above William Berry gave the Trefethen part of his farm to his grandson, Jonathan Hobbs. The latter, in 1812, sold to William Trefethen, Jr., Then Levi T. Walker and sister Eliza Ann came into possession of the property, and it is now occupied by George Perry. The Hoppings, prior to 1680, lived in the field belonging to Nathaniel Martin, who together with Samuel Walker sold the same with the mansion house thereon to Colonel Amos S. Parsons in 1822, and it is now owned by the heirs of Dr. Warren Parsons. This part of the town was known as Mardentown for many years. Ebenezer Sweeney, it is said, lived between Dr. Warren Parsons and George Perry. Samuel Morrison lived on the west corner. Then John Carroll and Simon Goss had a store prior to 1800. The store was continued by Thomas Rand and his brother Jebediah Rand and his son Thomas W. Rand. Simon Goss, about 1810, built a residence and opened a store in the basement of the same at Breakback Hill, more recently known as Meeting House Hill. He sold to Sevian Drake, then John Drake occupied the premises. He sold to Thomas J. Parsons, and since the death of the latter, it has been occupied as a residence by his son, L.B. Parsons. Joseph Philbrick, the blacksmith, lived on the north corner near Rand's store, then Colonel Amos S. Parsons and his sons James M. and Joseph. It is now the residence of Fred D. Parsons. On the opposite side of the highway, Dr. Joseph Parsons erected a house and was succeeded by his son, Dr. John Wilkes, and grandson, Dr. Warren Parsons. Captain Jonathan Wedgwood and his son David lived where Charles Walker resides. Job Foss and Simon Knowles, then Samuel Libby in 1800, Solomon Marden in 1807, then later his sons, Benjamin and Moses R., occupied the farm, and it is now the residence of Charles H. Lear. I'm going to finish for today with a note letting you know I will be continuing this chapter next Sunday evening at 5 o'clock, and I hope you'll join me for the Rye Historical Society Happy Hour and the conclusion of Chapter 5 of Parsons' History of Rye, Some Old Residents and Where They Lived. If you have any questions or would like access to records in the Town Museum, please visit our website at ryenhhistoricalsociety.org or just post us a note on our Facebook page. Thanks so much and look forward to seeing you next week.